Silhouettes will be some of the most impactful images in your projects because they're shots where you can really drive home an emotion. Whether it's happiness or loneliness, silhouettes are some of the best opportunities to do this. And one of the ways that you can drive home that emotion in a silhouette is in the color grading process. But color grading silhouette shots can be really tricky. And later in the video, I'll share a tip that's helped take my silhouette shots from basic to advanced and has actually helped me get silhouette shots where I felt like it wasn't really possible. I'm going to release a step-by-step color grade video soon, so for now, don't worry about the structure of my node tree. You can follow whatever order you typically do for your node tree, but all you'll need to understand is what I'm doing on each individual node. But for this video, you do need to know that I'll be editing in the DaVinci Wide Gamut DaVinci Intermediate color space. And my output space is Rec 709A because I'm on a MacBook. Rec 709 Scene also works, and if you're on a Windows, it's likely Rec 709 Gamma 2.4. So the first thing I do is convert my camera's color space to my timeline color space. And further down the node tree, I'll add an output node that converts the timeline color space to my output color space, Rec 709A. So one of the first things I do when color grading a silhouette shot is I bring down the exposure, because typically you're going to have to bring it down in order to get that silhouetted look. Now typically, I overexpose my shots so that I can have the cleanest silhouette shots possible, because sometimes if we try to expose for a moody image in camera, all we end up with is a noisy image in post-production. So if you can, try to expose a stop or two above, as long as you're not clipping the highlights, because the highlights are super important, especially for silhouette shots. And then in post-production, where we are now, we can bring that exposure down. And the way that I do that is with the HDR wheels. And you can push this really far. I've taken it down up to 3 stops before, but I do find that the more you have to bring down the exposure in post-production, the more you may have to lift up the highlights for the image to still feel natural. Because I find if we bring down the exposure too much in order to get those dark, deep shadows, sometimes the highlights get brought down too far and everything just feels too flat. I find typically 0.5 to 1 on the highlight slider helps bring the image back to a natural place. The next thing I'm going to do is white balance the image. And this is my favorite part of the silhouette color grading process because silhouettes are so great for pushing that exaggerated monochromatic look. So to change my white balance, I'll set my node's gamma to linear, and then the temp and tint sliders and the gain wheel act as an accurate way to change your white balance. So now you have the option to go for a very cool look, a very warm look, or a neutral look. The next thing I'm going to do is add some saturation, and specifically I'm going to aim to add a film-like saturation where the more saturated the colors get, the denser they feel. And I find this works very well for silhouette shots, especially when we're pushing one of those more exaggerated monochromatic looks. So to get film-like saturation, you can change your node's color space to HSV, you can turn off channel 1 and channel 3, and then you're left with just the saturation channel. Now the gain wheel is going to bring up the saturation, but it's going to impact the more saturated colors more than the others. The gamma wheel is going to bring up the saturation, but it's going to bring up the saturation of the less saturated colors faster than the more saturated colors. So you can play with the two to see what you prefer. Typically the gamma wheel is going to give you more of a film-like look where there's saturated and dense colors throughout the entire image. And the gain wheel is going to help keep things a little more digital because we're only impacting the more saturated colors. So we're not pumping saturation throughout the entire image. Once I've done this, I sometimes go back to my white balance node and just check if I'm really sitting where I want to sit. Because white balance in a way is saturation. If we pull things toward the cooler side, we're adding saturation to cooler colors, and we're taking saturation away from the warmer colors. And vice versa if we drag it towards the warmer end. So sometimes I'll set a white balance in the beginning and I'll get to a point that I really like, but really what I was doing was trying to just get a saturated look from the beginning. But now that I've gone and actually added saturation, I might actually be able to pull that white balance back to a place that feels more natural. So now I get the best of both worlds. I have the saturation that I was aiming for in the beginning, and I'm in a place where the white balance still feels very natural, despite going for an exaggerated look. And you can even try adding saturation first and then changing your white balance and see if you can get to a place you're happy with faster that way. But typically I'll do white balance, saturation, then a double check on the white balance, because I find if I'm trying to make changes to an image that has a bad white balance, it's extremely distracting. And I find it extremely challenging to set the right exposure, contrast, and saturation when I'm looking at an image that I can feel is not appropriately white balanced. Now here's the tip that's really saved me in circumstances where it felt like I couldn't get a silhouette even though it was possible. And that tip is to mask your subject. If you look at silhouette shots from some of the best cinematographers out there, what you'll notice is that the subject is the darkest thing in the frame. But that doesn't make sense, because why is everything else around it not as dark on the shadow side as the subject? And it's likely because there's some masking happening in post-production. So what I'll do is I'll go to the magic mask, I'll add my points and turn on the overlay so I can see what's happening. And once I've landed on a magic mask that looks good, I'll track that out, and then I'll use the HDR wheel to help bring down the exposure a little extra on my subject. Now, because we're making an unnatural change to the image, I don't like to push this too far. So typically I'll only bring it down about 1/4 or 1/2 of a stop of exposure, because once we start pushing past that, we may start breaking the image, or we may start drawing attention to how unnatural it feels. And the good thing about this trick is sometimes we do all the steps that I just mentioned and we get to this point and we just feel like the silhouette isn't possible. There's too much information on our subject. And this little step allows us to just knock that last bit of information out of our subject and get that true deep shadow silhouetted look. As I said earlier, overexposing your silhouette shots really helps you get a clean silhouette color grade, because you can bring down the exposure and you can avoid a lot of noise in the shadows. And obviously silhouettes have a lot of shadows. But one of the other reasons I love to overexpose silhouette shots is because you can decide where you want to keep information. If we expose evenly and we expose for a moody image in camera, and then we want to bring up the exposure of something later, we're now going to introduce a ton of noise, and it might even break the image up, and it might be distracting, and it's not going to look good. But when we overexpose, that information is actually there. So if our subject is interacting with something, or we just want to see something in our scene, we actually have the space to bring the exposure of that thing back up by just adding a window and using our HDR wheels. And now we have our silhouetted shot, but we can see whatever it is that we wanted to see in our scene. And the last thing I like to do is add some film grain to give it a bit of texture. And one of my favorite presets is the 16mm 250D. And I find turning up the strength to 0.25 puts it at a place where it's noticeable, but it doesn't feel too unnatural and it doesn't call too much attention to itself. Once you followed all these steps, you're going to land on a clean silhouette shot. Thanks for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.